Legacy of a Traitor. Book 1. Epilogue. That final message, less than 30 seconds ago, sent dread pouring through Seth. Jin had asked for peace and for focus, but the tiny form in the jar had been convulsing and changing colors every other second. It looked like it was in its death throes. Every second, Seth wanted to ask it again. Every second he needed to confirm that everything was all right, but he couldn't, or else he might destroy everything. Another minute passed, and Seth feared he would go mad from the stress. Jin was both alive and dead. The valley was both doomed and saved. Finally, he couldn't bear it anymore, and he uncovered the cloth from the jar on the ground. The unbearable tension passed, replaced by an unfathomable despair. The tiny form had dissolved, transformed into nothing more than a puddle of dark slime. Seth shouted a command. He shook it, even as he knew that this could only mean one thing. His father's secret had been destroyed, and with it, the sole hope of the valley. For a moment, he couldn't sense anything. He could barely feel fear, barely feel dread, barely even feel the air around him. Whatever it takes, I will keep them safe. Where had those words come from? Surely not from him. Even if I must wrench power from the High Keepers themselves, I will save them. No, they were in his voice, but he hadn't quite realized it yet. This valley is mine to protect. Even as this phantom determination was spoken by his husk, it was tempered by the retort and rebuke that arose from the plume of color near Traveler's Pass. He had already failed. A life of the valley had been lost to these outsiders. If Jin had perished, then Cullen was almost certainly dead as well. There were so many who had loved him, so many at the feast who had wished the forager good health, and there were the few who he had truly loved in return. Arthas the storyteller, Thorina of the village. How many more would mourn the lost if the enemies brought their domineering rule over the valley? He stood up, taking the phantasmic words and repeating them in his own heart, fighting against the endless wave of despair. There were those that he was responsible for, and they were in danger. For your sake, brave forager, I will not break. If the outsiders truly wanted to take the valley, then even if he failed to ultimately stop them, Seth would ensure that they would pay for every tree, every house, every drop of blood. His father's weapon had fought against the clans, and it had failed, yet he still lived. He stepped out onto the watchtower balcony, where he had watched the village and the valley from afar for so long in the past. Even now, the crimson cloud spread further across the sky, rising past the mountains and into the valley. Everyone would know of the threat. Any shred of secrecy had died with Jin. Rashon's way of seeing the world held partial truth, but it had failed to consider the honor and the birthright Seth held. The people looked to their lord for security, for confidence. He would either succeed in providing that, or he would die. How wretched he was for already succumbing to despair, but now that this epiphany was made known to him, never again would such a fate come to pass. If the world itself demanded him to provide that protection with everything he had, then Seth would use his very being to tear it from the depths, to obtain the strength of his father, no matter how tattered and stained his soul became. But even as his will steeled in absolute resolve and certainty, he couldn't stop the streams of tears flowing down his face. There was no snow at the bottom of the fissure, just rocks and dust and deep shadows cast by the looming mountains. Weapon struggled to see, to observe, to do anything. It felt as if yet another part of him had died again. Soon his eyes focused, and he could see an armored body lying shattered over on one of the rocks, and smell the thick scent of blood. Blood not just from the corpse, but from the sunny-haired boy sprawled out above him whose heart had stopped beating. Immediately, memory flooded back, and Weapon reformed into a hooded figure, cradling the human's broken head under his legs. How quickly he'd ran through the snowed woods! Lord Rotrar had expected him to counterattack, so when Weapon had left another part of himself for dead and shifted into his squirrel form to dash across the forest, the terrifying man had failed to truly cut Weapon apart. The agony had been almost impossible to sustain, but the possible pain of losing Cully and Snuffler had been even worse. They had already fallen over the endless cliff when Weapon had reached the bunch of soldiers coughing among the fiery wind that smelled of an evil breakfast, but Weapon could still observe them. Not a moment was wasted. Even as Clarence cried out in rage and the soldiers instinctively swatted away, Weapon leapt after them. He dove down into the abyss. There was only a single piece of weapon now, but it was enough. He had burst through the air, gripping each one by a claw attached to a new flying form entirely made of arcing, twisting wings. They were still falling too fast, but Weapon's entire might pulled Cully and Snuffler away from the sharp rocks of the incline, which sped past at a near unobservable speed. Or at least, almost all of them, but there was nothing Weapon could do as Cully went limp, his satchel and head scattering everywhere in the raging wind. As Weapon observed the flat ground rushing up at them, he had thought they were all about to die. Then Snuffler, squealing in desperation, shook free of the satchels in Weapon's grasp and tumbled down the side of the cliff. Had the pig done that on purpose? No matter the reason why, it had granted Weapon enough strength to slow the fall into the last moment, as he morphed around Cully in a coat of protection, taking the full brunt of the earth's blow. For a moment, Weapon had lost all sight, all sense, all memory. Then each returned in turn, and now he knew that everything he had done to save his friend had all been for nothing. A pit of hatred for this moment began to churn within Weapon, and it threatened to drag everything in the world into it. Weapon shivered. What a wretched fate! The entire side of his skull is caved in. What a fool you are for doing that! Clarence was angry, very angry. At least we're still alive, no thanks to you. It'll take some time, and we'll have to eat something to restore ourselves, but we can at least return to Master Cernier. Weapon didn't care that Clarence was angry. All of that was just stupid noise. I'm only repeating what Master Cernier said. It's pretty clear-cut that you need to get up on that wall and begin climbing back to the valley. Weapon closed his eyes. Master Cernier was important, but so was Cully, and Cully was right here. If you're going to complain that you're too weak to go back, then just look at that delicious pile of protein right there on your knees. It's barely fitting for a dog, but we don't really have a choice now, do we? Clarence needed to shut up. Why was he yelling so loudly? Weapon couldn't think. Well, what are you waiting for? Weapon hated Clarence. Shut up. Shut up. Shut up! Weapon opened his eyes. Clarence was still there. Weapon could still feel his anger, but he had gone quiet. As the echoes faded down the length of the fissure, Weapon realized that it wasn't just Clarence. Every voice that whispered in his mind had faded, leaving nothing but the faint whistle of the wind through the jagged spires of sandy stone. No, there remained the one voice that was Weapon. He could finally think. A moment later, an idea rushed through Weapon's mind, and hope pulsed through his whole being. He observed Cully's wounds, and yes, a tiny rhythm of energy still ran through his head. This would take so much more of himself than helping a squirrel, but if it saved Cully, Weapon didn't care. He observed as intently as he ever had, finding the thousands and millions of tiny pieces crushed and splintered and torn out of place. Then slowly, little by little, Weapon began to piece them together. However, none of it would eventually hold, not even if he held them there for many, many years. So, Weapon poured his essence into Cully. As soon as he did, feeling his whole form diminish and weaken, the effects faded away, barely changing a thing. But that wasn't nothing. Weapon felt scared. Did he have enough of himself to give? What would happen if he ran out? As the blood continued to flow, one of Cully's arms sank to the ground. No! Weapon doubled his efforts, then redoubled it, then again and again. First, his blood stopped flowing out. Then the torn flesh was restored. Then the blood began moving within once again. Then the bones were knit back together. Cully was no longer on Weapon's legs. There was not enough room on them. But still Weapon kept healing further and further. The sky darkened. Hours passed, and still he worked. Then, as darkness more complete than any night began to cover his vision, Weapon saw someone prod Cully's face. Then Cully's face moved on its own. All the fear in his heart vanished away, and with it, all the vision of reality. The shrill squeal was faint, very faint, but Cullen could hear it. It grew louder and more recognizable with every passing second, and soon he could feel Snuffler's snout desperately trying to awaken him. I'm up, girl, don't worry. He pushed himself to a sitting position and scratched her head. His hand came away with blood, and immediately the world solidified as adrenaline pumped through him. Snuffler! Are you all right? She grunted affirmations over and over, and after checking her closely, he realized that she was safe. Though she was bruised and suffered several burns over her face, it wasn't as bad as he'd thought. Then, where'd the blood come from? Was it his? As he thought this, the better question came to mind, and he was amazed that he hadn't even thought of it. How were they alive? More than that, how was he so unhurt? If that was his blood, then he should feel some sort of discomfort at the very least, but he felt better than ever. Also, where were they? The area around them was some sort of grassless ravine, the ground all a dull and dusty bronze, and though he could hear the whirls of a snowstorm above, and feel the fresh air of a way out through a slim pass ahead, they were too far away for either to be properly seen. Cullen realized that he was missing his satchel, but as he glanced back towards the base of the canyon to see that Snuffler had found it, he cried out in fear and stumbled back. Near where she had dropped it upon seeing Cullen's fallen form, an utterly shattered and crushed body dressed in the outsider's armor lay in a horrific pile. It was hardly recognizable as even being human. A sick feeling rushed through him, and he sank to the ground. That should have been Cullen. That fall should have killed him. What had spared Snuffler and himself? As he looked around dazed, he saw something else near his feet. It appeared to be like a tiny bat sprawled out on the ground, hardly larger than the palm of his hand. Before he could pick it up, it shook for a moment, then looked up at him, two tiny green eyes staring in wonder. Clarence? Cullen could hardly believe his eyes, but that piercing flash and the quickly growing grin were unmistakable. Is that you?
I'm glad to see your ability to put together only the most obvious of puzzles is well and intact.
Cullen blinked in surprise. The voice that came from this tiny spirit was familiar, yet so high-pitched. It sounded more like a mouse than a person.
Yes, it is I, and yes, I am your savior, though this insulting size is what I get for it.
A quizzical look was met by a scoff from Clarence.
Don't believe me? Just look at the hair on that side of your head.
Cullen stroked one of the strands from above his left ear over his eye, and he gasped. The whole thing had lost all of its golden color and had become entirely dark. Stranger than that, wisps of some sort of otherworldly smoke faded off of them like breath in the snow, twisting into the night sky. A sense of repulsion caught in his throat as he whispered. Is that what happens when you save someone? How many times have you done this before?
You happen to be the second, but there doesn't seem to be any side effects, unfortunately.
Cullen struggled to think of what to say as Clarence shifted his form slightly, transforming his cloak into wings. After a few moments of flapping them, the tiny spirit began to lift off the ground.
Well, now I'm light enough for this, he muttered.
Snuffler nudged his hair, moving the newly colored strands back into place with a few happy grunts. Cullen couldn't help but feel overwhelmed. Why had Clarence done so much for him? As he thought, the spirit flew against Cullen's face, stopping less than an inch away.
I expect this deal of ours to be altered a bit now. I've kept you from death, and now the least you can do is find me some food. After that...
Clarence looked up at the cliffside.
We need to find a way back.
Suddenly, memories of the outsiders and their viciousness sent pangs of worry and dread coursing through Cullen. What can we even do about them? We barely survived a single encounter, and that was just against a tiny portion of their might. Thoughts of his father, and of all the people in the valley began to flood his mind. All of the terror and fear that he'd buried, which only now he realized he'd done, was breaking the whole world as it rose. What would happen to everyone? Would they be killed, enslaved, or worse? He shivered, frozen, and Snuffler laid her head in his lap with soft snorts of concern. Clarence rolled his eyes.
Quit your pathetic whining. How should I know what to do about them?
He sighed and alighted upon Cullen's shoulder.
If it makes you feel any better at all, they're taking much longer to get across than I'd expected. It'll probably take them another month at least, maybe 2 with that snowstorm.
So there's still time to save them, Cullen whispered as his focus returned, though he chided himself for grasping at such faint hopes. I can find someone who can stand against them. Another spirit, perhaps, one stronger than you, Clarence. The creature folded its arms and clicked in scorn.
Please, I know no creature, alive or dead, that can surpass me on its own. Besides, we're beyond the valley and in the middle of nowhere. How many others are you expecting to find?
Beyond the valley. As the ramifications of what that meant unfolded in his head, Cullen leapt to his feet, barely noticing Clarence fall off of him, and slowly began moving northward, towards a large opening in the pass. Then he began to run. Though the shrill shouts of, "Wait up!" from Clarence hung in his ears, the pounding of his heart overtook everything else. He only stopped as he reached the edge of the cliff, facing the vast and open land he had seen for so many years from the heights of the Carefell Mountains. Now, only a handful of miles away, It lay before him clear and unclouded, an infinite sea of red and brown sand. The stars above glittered in 1,000 different constellations, and despite everything, hope flared in his chest. They were too weak to deal with their enemy now, but there, out in the vast land of infinite sand, the possibilities were endless. His father had mentioned such a place many times, and with it, stories of champions and heroes capable of defeating any monster. If he could find even one, if not more, and convince them, he could save the valley. Snuffler trotted up next to him, and dropped the only remaining satchel at his feet. It was torn, and almost everything that had been in it was gone, but it still held his pick, some rope, and miraculously several herbs and plants tucked into the inner pockets. He clutched the stone under his coat and smiled. Even if Lord Cernir was truly so vile as to call upon those monsters to gain control of the valley, his plan to cut away any loose ends had failed. Cullen had passed through death itself, alongside Snuffler and the small and snappish spirit who had finally caught up, landing on his shoulder again while muttering reprimands. The future was unknown. The dread of the two armies and their serpentine commander was immeasurable, and yet Cullen couldn't help but to truly smile as the realm of the world beyond called him onwards.